Okay, we'll try. So, in March 2024, Jacobsen published a timely non-fiction book called Nuclear War, a Scenario, in Finnish, suomeksi, Ydinsota, Näin, maailma, tuhoutuisi. The book is published by Bazar, and there's also a Finnish version right here. It outlines a timeline of a hypothetical first strike against the continental United States by North Korea. The book covers standard American military protocol in the event of a nuclear first strike against the US. Annie Jacobsen has spent more than a decade interviewing dozens of experts while mastering the voluminous literature of the subject, some of it declassified only in recent years. At least for me, the reading experience was like reading a ticking time bomb. It was very intense and thrilling. All right, I have a few questions for you. Firstly, what made you want to write in such detail how a nuclear war could unfold?
Yes, and also thank you so much for having me. And I must say, it's really a joy and a privilege to be here with the audience. I am Finnish. My maiden name is Soininen.
Yes, I heard.
And so I feel this kindredness to all of you. So thank you for having me.
Totally.
But, you know, I am a national security reporter, and I have written 6 previous books before nuclear war about war and weapons and national security and secrets and many, missions and operations that were violent. And I would often ask my sources, why did you do what you did? And a common answer, and now I'm talking about Cold War warriors, men who are in their 80s and 90s and fought the wars of the Cold War starting, I would say, why did you do this? And they would say, Annie, I did what I did to prevent nuclear World War III. And so in the last Trump administration, the first time he was president, I began to wonder when this fire and fury debate was happening between North Korea and the United States, I began to wonder what would happen if prevention fails. It's called deterrence in military speak. What happens if deterrence fails? And the result is the book Nuclear War, a Scenario.
Sounds very, very frightening. What was it like to interview all those people, including the former commander of Stratcom? Did you get any feeling that they're like playing a war game or something?
Well, it's a great question. And I must say, being able to interview the former commander of Stratcom was an extraordinary moment for me as a reporter, because the commander of Stratcom is the steward of all nuclear weapons in the United States and all nuclear weapon systems, the triad it is called. And so in the event that the president has to make a counterattack, he speaks to the commander of Stratcom and gives that order. And that is a stunning position of power in the United States. Most people in America don't know about Stratcom, and so probably our audience here does not either. And I'm very grateful that General Keeler, the former commander, went on the record with me, because I feel like he did a huge service to all of us by letting us know just how quickly nuclear war would unfold and how devastating it would be. What I learned in reporting this book from General Keeler and others is that no matter how nuclear war begins, and these are in true war games at the Pentagon, no matter how it begins, it only ends one way, in nuclear Armageddon.
Wow, was it difficult to get those interviews? I'm sure a lot of information is, figuratively speaking, under a rock and only declassified in a few years. So was it difficult to get all those people in record?
It's interesting because people sometimes report when they are writing about me or talking about me or introducing to me, they say, Annie Jacobsen gets all of this classified information. And I would like to make a note that is actually not accurate, because, and I'm not saying you're saying that, but people say that because classified information is classified, and you can't, if you are a source and has, classified information, you cannot reveal that to anyone or you will go to prison. And so what I am reporting is information that is simply not known. It is information of the government in the United States has a little kind of process, you could call it a trick, if you will, whereby these highly classified situations come time to be declassified and they are hidden. So they kind of disappear into the archives with, cover names or code names, as we call them, that reporters like myself would not know to look for unless one of your sources says you might want to look at Project 57, you might want to look at. And that allows me to then look at the documents that have been declassified and to be able to bring them to the public. And so the second part of your question, I think, is how do I get sources to work with me? And I think that has to do with the fact that my entire career has been working in this area. And so after decades of reporting and writing books, you begin to develop a form of trust with your sources. And I think that while many of my sources are sometimes perceived as what we might call twirling mustache bad guys here in the United States, in kind of Hollywood terms, they are actually real humans. They are people who dedicated their life to a certain component of the military, and then as they get older, perhaps have not necessarily a change of heart, but a change of perspective about what the public should know.
Did any of them feel guilty on what they were working with?
Well, that is an interesting question. Just plugging in my power cord here. Okay. I quote a man in the book named John Rubel, and it's in the beginning part of the book before we get into the ticking clock scenario whereby the world ends in 72 minutes. This is the part that sets up how we got here. And I quote John Rubel because he was a defense official from the 1960s when the initial buildup, the insane buildup of nuclear weapons was first happening. And it was Rubel who, in 2005, kind of on his deathbed, wrote a very thin memoir about his experience working with Stratcom. And he is the one who makes a kind of confessional that you may be referring to, where he talks about learning plans to kill several 100 million people on the other side of the world, and being part of this plan and not speaking up and saying anything. And this is a remarkable confession from him that came in 2005, and it went almost unnoticed. I write about it in the book and I quote him directly, and it is a very impactful part of the book, I believe. Many people ask about it because it gives you a window into how a person can be sort of numb to the reality of what they are actually participating in.
Truly remarkable. I also thought it was very interesting to learn about the continuation of administration. For example, in the book, the part where the President of the United States has only a few minutes to decide whether to strike back before an intergalactical ballistic nuclear warhead hits the US. But at the time when he has to make the decision, the president has no time because the security is pulling him to a helicopter to take him to safety. Do you think that's what really would happen in a situation like that?
Oh, yes. And I must say, for readers of the book, if you are ever curious, wait a minute, how could she possibly know this is what the Secret Service might do? You can go to the notes in the back of the book and see, oh, she interviewed the director of the Secret Service about these protocols. And sometimes I quote individuals precisely, so they are in quotes. And that is the case with that section of the book where the president gets moved. Sometimes the Secret Service director said to me, yes, this is a quote on the record. And other times, individuals have to talk to me in a general manner. Again, this points to the classification issues. But some of the incredible details, I think what shocks readers, because it certainly shocked me when I began reporting the book. First of all, you learn that the President of the United States has what is called sole presidential authority, which means in the event of a nuclear war, a nuclear strike against the United States will first of all launch on warning. We do not wait to absorb that nuclear blow. That shocks people. And the second thing is we have a sole presidential authority policy, which means the president alone makes the decision of what the counterattack is. He does not ask permission of anyone, not the Secretary of Defense, not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, not the Congress. I explain, how this goes down in the book. But as I was reporting this, it got me thinking what would happen with the president in terms of the Secret Service having a mission to keep the president alive. And thinking through a scenario whereby a nuclear missile is, as you say, is on its way to Washington, D.C., as I write in the book, what would the Secret Service do? And while you would have the Stratcom commander wanting to get that counterattack from the president immediately over video conference, that's called jamming the president, I learned that the Secret Service would be focused on getting the president out of Washington, D.C. immediately, because the intercontinental ballistic missile takes only 33 minutes to get from North Korea to the United States. And then readers learn this series of missteps that happens as you're trying to hustle the president out of the White House into Marine One helicopter and fly away.
And the president truly has only a few minutes, was it 4, to decide whether to strike back and with how much force, right?
Yes, the amount of time, if I heard you correctly, was the president has 6 minutes.
6 minutes.
6-minute window to decide what weapons and how many are going to be used in the counterstrike. And people say, this is astonishing. How could this be true? This is known among officials in Washington. But one source that I found remarkable to be able to relay on the record was from President Ronald Reagan, former President Ronald Reagan himself. He's the only president who has ever mentioned this 6-minute window precisely. And he did so in his memoir. And I quote him directly in the book, but he says something like, a 6-minute window, how could, and he calls it an irrational amount of time to have to determine to unleash Armageddon. His quote is spectacular.
That's crazy. It was also very frightening even to read about the part of a nuclear electromagnetic pulse. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
It's a very unknown detail, but hotly debated and terrifyingly so among high-ranking officials who deal with this problem with counterproliferation. And I quote the different individuals in the book, including the former commander of Cyber Command in the United States, General Tuhill. And as it was explained to me, the fear is that a rogue nation like North Korea could, and there was a fear that in 2016 they actually had, lofted into a satellite that is orbiting the Earth disguised as, let's say, a radio satellite or a reconnaissance satellite, that inside that satellite, which goes around the Earth, every 92 minutes, would be a small nuclear warhead. It didn't even need to be that big. But if it was detonated remotely over the United States, specifically over the center of the continental United States, at exactly 300 miles altitude, it would cause an electromagnetic pulse, which would essentially take out the entire power grid of the United States, all of it. And I write about the consequences of that happening in the book, in sort of the third act of the book, because it is very much an all is lost moment where suddenly you realize it is all ending very quickly.
In the book, North Korea also strikes the US by a missile launched from a North Korean submarine towards the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant in California. And the consequences truly are awful. Could you talk us through what really happens if a nuclear warhead strikes a nuclear power plant? Did we lost you? The internet is trying to reconnect. Yikes.
It was great until this moment.
So far, so good. Yeah. Yes, the AMP. EMP.
We are working. It's there in the stage side.
Ei, kun se on meidän puolella. Katkes yhteys. Can you hear us?
Okay?
Yep. Oh, now I can hear you.
Great, all good.
We are rolling. Yeah, please continue.
Okay, I'll ask the question again. Could you talk us through what really happens if a nuclear warhead strikes a nuclear power plant?
Absolutely. You know, this is what was described to me as the worst of the worst case scenarios. And again, it was something that when I was working on the book, people who were not inside the government, inside Los Alamos, really questioned, wait a minute, Annie, could this really happen? And so just to give a heads up here, I sourced this information and quoted nuclear weapons designers at Los Alamos to talk about this because, you know, there is a rule with the International Committee on the Red Cross, and it's a Geneva Convention protocol called Rule 42, that you cannot strike a nuclear facility. And, you know, to talk about real world events, of course, when I was originally working on the book, this is before Russia invaded Ukraine. And we now see the threat level with the Zaporizhzhia power plant there. You can realize how incredibly dangerous it is to be having weapons, conventional weapons, going off around a nuclear facility. But of course, in the book, having a nuclear missile strike a nuclear power plant results in what is called a core reactor meltdown. And in the Japanese call it the devil's scenario. And that is because it almost happened in Fukushima when the tidal wave took out the electricity and almost created this meltdown situation. But it's important to remember that in addition to these megawatt reactors that are working at a facility like Diablo Canyon in California, in the scenario that I write, there are also something like, you know, the amount, the metric tonnage of spent nuclear fuel rods on site, if hit with a nuclear weapon, would create a radioactive catastrophe that would last, and this is a quote from Los Alamos, thousands of years. In the case of California, it would ruin most of California, Nevada, all the way to Colorado. And this kind of a catastrophe, I wanted to point out, is something that is so far out of the sphere of most of our everyday thinking. And yet it speaks to bigger issues, I think also like conventional wars that are happening now.
Truly the devil's plan. I also have a few questions besides the book. Firstly, what do you think is the solution to prevent all this? A nuclear war, the devil's plan, EMP, etc.?
You know, it's perhaps the most important question. And I am sitting here in Los Angeles, California, an American, reading the newspaper of our current new president having authorized something he calls the Golden Dome, you know. And so on the one hand, you have a group of individuals, militarists, thinking the best defense is what I might say is more offense. And I think that is the fundamental premise of the book, which is nuclear war is insane. And if deterrence fails, it will all unravel. And so what is the solution? Well, I'm an author, I'm a journalist. I've met many individuals in disarmament in working on this book and on the book tour, and I've learned so much from them. And I would have to say, whenever anyone asks this question to me, is look toward the United Nations, to the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Look at all that work being done, and it's been done for decades by people dedicated to disarmament. I mean, I am someone who believes that less nuclear weapons make us more safe. And you know, the one hopeful note, which I will share if you like me to, is the story of Ronald Reagan's change of heart. Shall I tell that story?
Sure, sounds good.
Okay. I mean, it's the only hopeful note in all of this. And I think it's particularly important because I really value the idea that humans are capable of changing their minds, are capable of changing their position on something once they get more information. And sometimes that information comes by way of a story. That is certainly what I intended to do in nuclear war scenario, was make people aware of, in appalling detail, how horrific a nuclear war would be. Maybe not necessarily just to scare them, but to allow them to perhaps change their mind. And that happened to Ronald Reagan in 1983. He came into office a nuclear hawk. He believed and spoke on the record that more nuclear weapons made us more safe. Ironically, he's the one who came up with the idea of the dome to begin with, the Star Wars it was called, which I think President Trump is currently emulating with his Golden Dome. But, despite probably being, or rather definitely being told by a lot of smart scientists, many of whom I interviewed, that the dome wouldn't work, Reagan pushed forward. But then one night he watched an ABC television movie called The Day After. And it imagined a nuclear war between Russia and the United States. Ronald Reagan wrote in his White House journal that he became depressed after seeing that film. And as a result, he changed his mind. He reached out to the Soviet Union, to Gorbachev. That was the twirling mustache bad guy of the day in 1983. He reached out to Gorbachev, and because of their work together, starting at Reykjavik, the world went from the all-time high in 1986 of 70,000 nuclear warheads, 70,000, to the approximately 12,300 we have today. That is because of communication. So my long-winded answer to your question is communicate with the person on the other side of the aisle.
And if Reagan can change his mind, so can many others. Hopefully.
So can many others.
But sadly, right now, it seems that quite a few people, at least in Finland, seem to think that it would be possible to have a very limited and even small targeted aerial use of nuclear weapons. Is it really?
So that is in my opinion, and my strong opinion, and my knowledgeable opinion, that is absolute fantasy. And I will tell you why. Nuclear war games at the Pentagon are jealously guarded. There are hundreds of them every year. Hundreds of them. They are all classified. No one has access to them, not me. One has been declassified from 1983, from the Reagan era, and it was called Proud Prophet. And I reprint a page in the book, and you can see it. And readers may quickly flip to that book on the table and say, and then they suddenly look at it and they realize it's entirely redacted, meaning it's blacked out. The only word you see in the redacted thing is the word scenario. And so people may say, well, why would you, what's the point of declassifying it? Well, here's the point, and this brings us back to your opening question to me. When something is declassified, it allows people who participated in that program to speak about it in a general way. And so we have on record Professor Paul Bracken, who participated in that war game. He's now a Yale professor. And he tells us in a general way what happens in a nuclear war game. He says, no matter how it begins, if NATO is involved, if tactical nuclear weapons are involved, if China is involved, no matter how it begins, if the United States gets involved, it ends in nuclear Armageddon. And so to anyone who believes that a tactical weapon is simply a more powerful battlefield weapon, I would suggest they read Nuclear War Scenario and think about that as an idea.
Truly. You also spoke a bit about the TPNW, in Finnish ydinasekieltosopimus. Do you think that smaller countries like Finland or the Nordics in general can have a role in disarmament discussions? Or is it only a war game for the big states and the nuclear weapon states?
That is perhaps the most important question. And let me say that the example I gave of Reagan and Gorbachev working together as adversaries, not enemies, communicating and working on moving, they issued a joint statement that said, nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So to your question, what about all of us? Well, I'm often reminded by my colleagues at the TPNW that situation in the 1980s did not happen in a vacuum. People were protesting against nuclear weapons in Central Park in New York City, in Hyde Park in London. Perhaps they were, all around the world. So what presidents do does not happen in a vacuum. And so the more attention that I believe is put on this issue of the existential threat that nuclear weapons pose to all of us, our leaders, in air quotes, like to be popular.
Yes, that's right. Unfortunately, I think we are running out of time, but thank you so much, Annie, for participating all the way from California in the morning. Funny to say that because it's over 7 p.m. already, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Okei, tuolla on Annin kirjaa, näkyy ainakin tuossa pöydässä heti olevan, niin todella suosittelen kaikkia lukemaan ja perehtymään. Se on aika kylmäävää tekstiä. Kiitos kaikille.